Hey everybody, how we doing? Welcome back. It's December 8th. It's about 10 o'clock at night. And daughter's sleeping, so I figured I'd do an update video on what we got going on with the John Deere D, the 27D. If you guys checked out the community page, I put some photographs up of some smaller parts that we cleaned up, but I wanted to go through all those parts and kind of describe what it was we were looking at. But before we do that, tomorrow morning we are headed back to the farm, so to speak, and we're going to get that John Deere 60 out of the woods and over here to Rusty Nuts Ranch. So let's hope everything goes well with that. I did stop over there today, and we've had quite the warm spell here in Minnesota. It's been upper 40s to mid 50s the last 2 or 3 days. So before we left last weekend, I cracked the drain plug on the transmission and rear end housing and left it hanging by just a couple threads. If you do that, generally if there's any water in the bottom, it'll drip past whatever threads are left hanging onto that drain plug, and it'll still keep the gear oil in the rear end. So I went back today, pulled that drain plug out, and I bet probably at least a gallon of water came out of the bottom of that thing. And then we started getting a little oil, put it back up in there, and started rocking it around just using the rear wheels, and that thing rolls freely. So sounds like we won't have to bring any heat with us. We can just head over there with the trailer, winch it on, and go. So that's the plan. Rudy's going to meet me over there in the morning, and we'll get that thing loaded up. Should go fine. So here's hoping. But let's head in the house. We'll take a look at those parts that I got, and I'll describe kind of what it is we cleaned up, and a couple of the things I'll show you how they work. So let's head in. Okay, we're going to kind of work our ways from left to right over here, but first thing we got here on the left is this would be the kind of intermediate gear, if you will, between the camshaft and the governor. So basically a governor drive gear, but it goes between the camshaft and the governor. This is the stud, the machine stud that it rides on. It has an oil galley machined into it. Pretty simple assembly. Just slides through. If we spin it around here, there's a pin in the top of the shaft, and this spacer washer has a notch in it. This is basically a thrust washer, so that goes here, and then this goes against the case, the inside of the case. Then the nut spins on the outside, and it's pinned into place with the cotter pin. This is the original cotter pin, but I always keep them just to have them laying around. So we clean that up. Everything looks good. The bushing looks good. Everything's nice and tight. There's hardly any movement in that bushing, just a slight ticking back and forth. So that's good. So moving over this way, we've got your camshaft bearings. Now, there are no inserts in these. I'm probably just going to polish them up with a light wire wheel inside here, a small wire wheel, just to polish them up. And then we have a series of spacers. They go on either side of the cam, depending on where you need to center it in relation to these gears here, this gear, and then the crankshaft gear. So that's those pieces. What else do we have here? We've got the governor fan shaft drive gear, and then our pinion gear that actually goes on the end of the fan shaft. These were new old stock, and the originals had a straight cut gear. The newer style is a helical cut. Most of the Ds have been upgraded to these if they had the straight gut gears in them still. These are a lot quieter gear set, so you don't get as much of a howling noise out of them. So we found these through a gentleman in Duluth, Minnesota. So big thanks to him. Alex, if you're watching, huge thank you for sending these down. Much appreciated. Moving on from there, we have kind of some worn out components and some not so worn out components, but essentially this is what makes up the oil pump here. So you have your oil pump housing. This is where the oil pump gears actually are. So you've got the longer shaft is the keyed shaft that goes into this one here, and there's a longer embossment on the back for the longer shaft on the inside of the pump. Then we have the shorter shaft, which isn't driven by anything. It just slides into this journal. Then you have your keyed pump drive gear. Now this gear, if you guys can see that, is very heavily pitted on the teeth. There's a lot of chipping. I actually located another gear for this. This section of the gearing is nice, but then you come around back to this side and we start getting into the pitting and chipping again. This tooth here is really bad. This one's bad. But anyhow, this gear gets pressed onto this shaft. It is keyed, so you have to pay attention to that. You've got your key right here. Oops. Don't want to lose that gear. Here's the key for that gear. And then you have your backing plate for the pump gears. This isn't exactly working out like I planned, but your backing plate for the pump gears goes here, like this. There's a little ear that goes down towards the bottom. If you didn't put it that way, it would interfere with this portion, which is the pump screen, and even still, it wouldn't align with the machine surface of the pump itself. So it can only go on one way. You got a couple bolts here. Just like that. Set these aside. And then you have your relief valve, which goes just like this. So you have basically a poppet, or I guess this would be the valve if you want to call it that. There's a series of washers. Now, there's two fully round washers for this. One goes on first, then there's a washer that has a small notch in it that goes on the middle, and then the fully round washer goes on the top again. And then you have your pressure spring, your relief spring, and that drops down into here, and it's kept in place by this large acorn nut. And there is a copper washer between these two, which is right here. This is the original. Obviously, we're going to replace this as we reassemble everything, but for the sake of video, let's do it right. Copper washer. Into the backing plate. Just like that. So it would look like that. Well, actually, it's upside down. It would look like this reassembled. Your pickup screen would go into here, and there's a big backing plate for your pickup screen there. And then this mounts to the side of the crankcase housing behind the flywheel, so the flywheel would be turning right here. And then this would mesh with, I believe, the crankshaft. So that's the pump. Before we move on to the next piece, I'm going to grab another piece here that was very interesting on this. So give me one moment. So this acorn nut here, this large acorn nut, this actually came off of the 28. Now, if we look at the pump backing plate for the 27, this was the one that was on the 27, there's a large casting flaw. Nope, and I just noticed that I put the spring and everything on backwards. So let's fix that before we move on. But this backing plate had a big casting flaw here where the bolt goes into the through the plate and then into the pump body itself. This one had some pretty significant grooves worn into the backing plate here. The one out of the 28 had some pitting, but we should be able to polish that out. But it didn't have any grooves worn to it by the gears, which was nice. So that was a major issue with this one, was the significant groove that was worn to this. I mean, if you guys can hear that, I can catch a good chunk of it with my fingernail. So that was the first thing wrong with this. Now the second thing, and what I thought was odd, was the acorn nut had a hole in it, if you guys can see that. And this poppet, or the valve, the pressure relief valve, would come up into that hole, but I couldn't for the life of me understand how that was going to prevent oil from spewing out of here. So I asked a local resident D expert that I know, Mr. Hans, and he informed me that this was not in fact the correct nut for the bottom of the backing plate, or the top rather. No, that would be the bottom. Was not the correct nut for the bottom of the backing plate, but it is in fact off of an early Spoker D. This is for the large redhead pin style oil pressure gauge. So essentially what would happen was, this is the oil pressure gauge for the early Ds. Now this also is a redhead pin, but it's one piece casted here. If you guys look at the early Spoker D, which I have a photo of, this portion here is a large hole like you would find in this end, and it's threaded. This nut threads into the top of the oil pressure indicator housing, and then the pin rises through this acorn nut, indicating that you have oil pressure. So for example, this is the pin out of this particular oil pressure indicator housing. Essentially, as you create oil pressure, the pin rises up and indicates that you have oil pressure, and these were painted red. And that's why they call them a redhead oil pressure indicator. So this is actually a fairly hard to come by piece, and since I needed a pump gear, I worked out a little deal with a friend of mine. I will trade him this piece for the pump gear, and he was okay with that. So that's what we're going to do with this. But before we move on to anything else, let's fix this, since I put it together backwards. Okay, so we've got the poppet, the spring, round washer, washer with a notch, round washer. Can put that into the nut. put that back into the backing plate. There we go. So that's that piece. This one we are going to put, oh, hold on a minute. Put this back together because it's actually going to go to our friend Hans. Yeah, there's no way for the life of me that I can't believe this thing didn't leak like a sieve, because this would be upside down. And as the plunger or the valve moves up and down in here with oil pressure, this would leak oil everywhere, in my opinion. So that's not correct. The last piece that we have cleaned up is the oil pressure indicator. Not much for parts. You've got an oil line fitting here. Oh, come on. You've got another elbow here. You've got your plunger. Oh, wait a minute. Spring and plunger. And then there's another fitting on the bottom. So this is what our indicator looks like when it's assembled. These are oil overflow holes. So what happens is oil comes in from the pickup, then it gets distributed out through these back to the bearings and the other areas. But as oil comes in from the pump and the pickup, it fills this reservoir, pushes that plunger up, and indicates that you have oil pressure. And it will not come out the top of here, or if it does, it'd be very, very tiny amount. But oil is going to follow the path of least resistance. So if it gets up past that plunger, it's going to first come out these large holes in the indicator body before it even reaches the top. So it'll just squirt out of these holes here before it ever comes out whatever gap is up here. So again, as pressure rises, the pin rises as the reservoir fills, and then the oil will be distributed to the bearings, and then whatever excess will come out the pump body itself. So that's pretty much it. There is a unique difference between this early 27 body and the later 28 body, which I'll show you. The early 27 did not have a square plug here. This 28 model has another embossment here, with a pipe plug right here. Kind of an interesting deal. I don't know what the change is for, why, if it's an auxiliary port for another oil line to go somewhere. I have no idea. So if somebody can tell me why the later models have a square pipe plug here, that would be great, because I really don't know. They're the same part number on the body, D815R, but this one is obviously different. This is the later model, the 28D. This one was very badly seized up. They were both seized up, but the one out of the 28 was bad. The spring was very, very much deteriorated. It came out in about 3 pieces. Well, what was left of it anyway. And the plunger on both of these is in really good shape. So this one I'll have to get a new spring for, and this one will be for sale. So if somebody wants it for their collection, or if they need it for their D, I'm going to sell this one. I don't know how much I'm going to ask for it. Have to do some research on eBay, but probably not a whole lot. So if anybody's interested, this one will be for sale. It's all cleaned up. Everything's been blasted. I'll get a new spring for it, so it'll be ready to go. So that's going to do it for this episode. Just a quick update on the 27D and what's been going on with cleaning up some smaller parts. So hopefully in the morning we'll be headed out of here by 9:30, and back before noon. That's the goal anyway. We'll get that thing on the trailer and hauled back here and set over there in the row of antique tractors. So thanks for watching, guys. I appreciate it. And again, we've got hats available if you guys are interested. I still have to make a video showing everything that we're offering. I've got some more coming, some different colors, and I wanted to wait until I got those before I did a video on the hats that we're offering. So anyhow, thanks for watching, guys. We'll see you in the next one.